All right, it's Alexander Lawrence from the Portable Infinite. And yeah, we got a surprise today because Craig Clevenger, here's his book right here, Mother Howl. This is his third novel. I know me and Craig Clevenger went to Long Beach State back in the '80s and stuff, and that was, I mean, we some of these interviews we did. I mean, we mentioned people like Gerald Laughlin and Stan Gintarski, who was a professor there at Long Beach State, and let's see. We'll get to that. Well, let me just talk about Craig here. He's an author of 3 books. He grew up in Dallas, Texas, or he was born in Dallas, Texas. Grew up in Southern California. Went to Long Beach State, and then when I graduated in '88, we're like at exactly the same age. I'm born May '64. What month are you? How old?
December, yeah.
'64. So I'm like 6 months older and stuff. But we were going out. When did you finish at Long Beach State?
Well, I never actually graduated.
Oh, okay.
I was 11 units shy. By the time I had enough lower division, general ed requirements under my belt to start taking creative writing, I jumped straight into it. And in fact, I even doubled up on some classes because I wanted to get as many workshops under my belt as I could. So at the 4-year mark, I was actually 11 units shy of a bachelor's. And I never went there to be a bachelor in English. I went there to be a writer. So I'd maxed out all my writing, and I was bootstrapping it. I pretty much scraped my way through college myself. And the thought of doing it for another summer and then a semester after that, I was young, time stretched much longer back then. It was just intolerable to me. So I just took that and left. And, in hindsight, maybe not the greatest idea, but hey, I went to be a writer and here I am. So,
Well, I mean, that Marilyn Johnson was really the only creative writing class I took. I was more of a lit major. And I mean, at that time, I mean, the creative writing department, there was the Elliot Fried, Gerald Laughlin faction, which was kind of like post Bukowski, post beat kind
yeah.
of vibe. And a lot of the people were into that. And then let's see what else.
There's Charles May, Ray Zapata. Those were
Yeah,
the
yeah.
heavyweights
Charles
there.
was one of the serious guys. I mean, he was like a serious. I mean, Lachlan got his PhD when he was like 22 or something. He was a real
Yeah.
smart guy, but he kind of came off like this. His books were kind of like this post Bukowski thing. I don't know. He just died recently of COVID.
Yeah. Yeah.
But although I look back and you were friends with Ray Zapata too, right?
No, I never had a class with him. I knew him in passing, but I never had him. Charles May was one of Marilyn Johnson, a couple classes with her. I took 2 or 3 workshops with Gerald Laughlin.
Okay.
And I think it was just, really no preference, just a matter of like what was available. I was trying to, I was working full time and going to school full time, so trying to squeeze in whatever workshops I could. I was not neck deep in that post beat scene though. I like
it was I was. I mean, I took that one class. I actually won the Ronald Foote Poetry Award in '88.
Oh, right, okay.
Even though I wasn't even part of the, I mean, that was a creative writing department thing. And then I was an editor for the Union. Do we publish your stuff in the Union ever?
A couple times, yeah. I'm not sure if you were at the Union or not. You must have been, yeah, a couple times.
I was there because, because my memory of that class, there was me, there was Christopher Poindexter, who was kind of like a wise guy. I tried.
God, you got a memory like a steel trap. I don't, man.
I tried to contact. He was doing this magazine called Great God Pan in the '90s, and I kind of because I was doing, like my own history. I went from San Francisco, and I ended up going to San Francisco Art Institute and studying with Kathy Acker and
okay,
and Lydia Lunch was teaching there too. Mary Gateskill. That was where all the kind of writers were at Art Institute.
Heavyweights, it sounds like.
Yeah, because like Berkeley was more like a poetry school, and then SS State was a little bit different, but maybe more poetry oriented. So a lot of the writers that I was kind of into were kind of showing up at Art Institute. So I just kind of like audited those classes. And so I never really, I met Lydia Lunch, who you just did an interview with recently. I met her a few times, but I just never had any really I've met her, never really did any interviews or anything with her, but like like I was doing, and then I met Dave Eggers in '93, and I did some magazines with him in San Francisco. That's I kind of like, I had like and then in San Francisco the scene's so small that if you're writing for one magazine, you're writing for all the magazines there. And so I was like, and that was also the great time for writers. So every writer I interviewed in the '90s, all the Volman, Martin Amis, Freddie Sinellis, they all were getting big book advances. There was an expansion of Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, that's back when, that was right when we got out of there. When we finished Cal State, I think Michael Chabon got the 7-figure advance while he was still at UCI grad, and that made news. That was the first time, and that kind of created the land grab. The agents were rushing the grad programs. I think the grad programs locked that down. It was too distracting, but that kind of fucked with everybody's expectations going forward after that, I think.
Yeah, that's why I met Chabon in '87 or '88. Like when he was still at UCI, and he had his first book came out, and he was like I guess he was like the same age as us too.
Yeah.
And he was teaching at University Community College in Irvine, the whatever it's called. I don't know. He was teaching a class there, and so I met him back in those days, and I ended up interviewing him in '95. So since Barnes and Noble, with the expansion, all these authors were coming to San Francisco. So I interviewed Ginsberg, pretty much every bit, Mark Leiner, Kathy Acker, Mary Gates Scott moved to San Francisco. A lot of people were moving to San Francisco. I was big friends with Volman, and okay, so I think, and then like Chris Poindexter, I just kind of found out he was doing Great God Pan, and I go, hey, you should do something for my magazine, and he sent me this 10,000 page thing about William Peter Blatty and The Exorcist, and I'm going, oh my God, how am I going to cut this down? I mean, people would do that to me, send me these like really, and then you mentioned your book, Dermaphoria, was kind of named after the Darius James Negrophobia.
That was the inspiration for it. Like, just that was I saw that, but I actually read with Darius James once.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because he was somebody that was in Cups magazine, which I was doing at the time, and he was like and I think, he was kind of, and I hung out with him a little bit in New York, so it was kind of funny that you even knew who he was,
Well, he was, I'd seen that book, and it was right around the time I was reading Seth Morgan's Homeboy, and so I was in this real wordplay sort of notion and the original title for Dermaphoria was Dermaphobia, like negrophobia, but as the story kind of coalesced, it didn't make any sense, and I realized I'd switch it up, and it clicked a little better. Funny thing, you mentioned William Peter Blatty. I actually wrote part of Dermaphoria in a house he once owned.
Oh, wow.
Woman I was dating, had a job. He was owned by a big record executive, and she had a job digitizing his entire gargantuan CD library. And so I hung out with her one day while she did that and wrote. And apparently that house used to be owned by William Peter Blatty, for whatever that's worth. It's not the greatest anecdote, but there you have it. William Peter Blatty touched the Dermaphoria somehow, indirectly, from beyond the grave.
So you're like, let me just put this out there. Okay, so you have the Contortionist Handbook as your first book, Dermaphobia, and then
Dermaphoria, Mother HOWL,
and Mother HOWL here. But like getting back to the class, okay, so I was in it. I probably just came off as like the self-appointed dandy writer back, because everybody
wore suits. You wore suits to class.
Yeah. Well, people told me I look like. People keep on telling me, "Hey, you look like Oscar Wilde. You look like Oscar Wilde." I go, "Yeah." And I go, "Who's this Oscar Wilde guy?" And then I saw a picture of him. I go, "Yeah, I guess I do look like him." So I kind of played that up for a couple of years.
That makes sense now. The haircut.
And but I'm, I must have came off as like, and I liked all that kind of art for art's sake kind of stuff. So compared to Craig Clevenger, I was like just the total opposite, just the arty party one. And there was Chris Poindexter, who was kind of like almost like a comedian, just like this surfer guy. I don't even know.
I'm trying to. The name rings a faint bell, but
and I remember that, and there was like some Vietnamese girl that wrote these real kind of metaphor, kind of magic realism stories. I still have some of the stories. I might have some of your old stories. What were you writing back then in the '80s?
Oh, very earnest, very, very earnest things that were above me, to be honest.
But let me just say, I mean, you were kind of like the quiet guy at the back, and then we saw a couple of your stories and go, okay, well, this guy's a forest. I don't know him very well, but he's. I mean, even at that back in '87, when I took that class, I was like, oh, okay, well, he's not my cup of tea, but he's doing something that's valid. So I mean, we kind of lost track of each other in those years, but
I didn't keep track of anybody after I left there. Yeah.
but when I went into the bookstore and I saw the Contortionist Handbook, and Craig Clevenger published a book. It didn't surprise me at all. I didn't go, oh, where did this guy? Where did this? Yeah, because
Who did he scam? Who did he sleep with?
well, no, I mean, well, that's good. Well, that's whatever. But I'm just saying, like, from that class in the Long Beach, like another person from Long Beach State is Ma Shane Wynn, and she's kind of like the poet and a laureate of the East Bay now or something, so like she's still around. There's me. I published a book in 2007, and short stories, and I came out with the hipster handbook, and I got kind of like in the '90s I kind of got into the magazine world, and I got to interview all my heroes and all the writers and got to hang out. And then after 2000, I was more kind of interviewing bands. And then the last 10 years or so, I've been more kind of managing bands and tour managing.
Yeah.
So, because, you got to go where the money is. I was like, when I first went to San Francisco, I was just working any kind of odd job. And until I met Dave Eggers, I mean, and a lot of these magazine people in '93, that kind of kept me on the straight path. Because like as a writer, you need like some kind of stability. You have to have a couple things. You have to have like a cheap apartment, a girlfriend with a good job and bank account, and a rich uncle and that lives in the Upper East Side or something. So there's like writer. You can't. I mean, people romanticize writers.
People romanticize poverty-stricken writers, and it's ridiculous.
But that's not true then, and it's definitely not true now and stuff. Okay, so that's the background. Okay, so we covered that. You grew up in Tustin,
Yeah,
and Long Beach State, and you lived in.
I've lived all over the place.
What about London? Where did you mentioned before that you lived in London? What neighborhoods there?
Twickenham.
Oh, okay, so North London.
I was only there for about 6 months. I lived in Dublin for the year and a half before that, but honestly, both of those places were just landing pads. I lived out of a bag for 2 years. I mean, honestly, I lived, Heathrow. I was at Heathrow more than I was at either one of my apartments. That was just traveling, business traveling full time. I stumbled backward into a job that would allow me, without a degree to, it was the very beginning of the high tech explosion before the .com cancer came, and it was a job where I could, speaking of poverty, I could finally make a decent living. Because I had just been living hand to mouth for years collecting rejection slips. And so I got that job, and it gradually took over my life. And I stopped writing. I couldn't. I was so sucked into it. And I ended up moving over there to help out at the international office. And I spent most of my time training all of our European resellers living out of a bag. And I kept staying by writing on airplanes. But yeah, that's what I did over there.
Yeah, because I mean, in San Francisco, I mean, it was when I lived there in the '80s, it was still kind of bohemian, and you can live in these big Victorians for $200 a month. And I moved to New York in '95, '96, and people were going, "Oh, the rents have went up," and then I come back in '98 and visit, and there all these people that I knew that were kind of like, selling weed and doing all these whatever in San Francisco, barely, working at cafe jobs. All of a sudden they had like these 100,000 a year jobs working for CNET. And I go, I helped this person write an essay for their stupid class in San Francisco State like 10 years ago. Now they got like they're getting paid twice as much as I am. And it's like, are they even qualified? It was just all these cancers that that kind of lived in San Francisco from 95 on, just had these like really, and I don't even know if they did anything, really.
My brother tells me a story. When I first started bartending up there, I moved up there. He knew one of the guys I worked with really well, and they were both talking about the pre.com old days. I mean, you could hit the town with $20 in your pocket, and that was a really lush night out. That was enough for taxis to multiple bars and drinks at multiple bars, and it was just fine, and maybe a little weed at the end. And now you can't walk out your front door without dropping $75 just to get from point A to point B,
Yeah. Well, now I just went to San Francisco like this year, and now like a burrito is almost like $20,
Yeah. I was up there, I signed some stock at City Lights last month, and I wanted to beat the traffic. I left at 2 in the afternoon, thinking if I can get to Silicon Valley, like Mountain View-ish by 3, I'll be okay. After that, it's smooth sailing. And it took me 4 hours to do the first 100 miles. It was an absolute goat fuck. So my threshold for metropolitan life is pretty much gone at this stage.
So let's talk about your fiction. Let's get to the fiction. Okay, so I mean this theme of identity comes up in your books a lot. Like people, like the guy in this new book here, he gets a fake ID, and he's trying to escape his past a little bit. It seems like in all your books, the subject of identity comes up a lot. Or what's this identity? Is it made up? Is it a fiction, or what's going on there?
I honestly do not know. I mean, the themes that crop up in what I'm writing are not things that preoccupy me, 24/7. They're not things that I bring into conversation that I can expound philosophically about. For something about just rebooting yourself and having a clean slate somehow bleeds through. There's something that subconsciously, the day I figure it out is probably the day I'll stop writing. I think not knowing is what keeps me writing, but I couldn't tell you. And it was never my intention. It's never been, but that's what keeps bleeding through. And your guess is as good as mine.
So what about your writer's voice? I mean, they always talk. I mean, that's like an old like fictions workshop thing. Like find your voice. I mean, I have some of your old stories from that class from the '80s, but
please burn those. Please put those into the shredder.
I sold I made a bunch of money. I had letters from David Foster Wallace, and I sold them for like $5,000 like a couple years ago.
Wow.
So, but so I'm holding on to the, you gotta get more popular, and that could sell your early work. So what about the writer's voice? When did you think like you found your writer's voice? I mean, you've been definitely had a vision of the past. It's 35, 40 years now of being a writer, and how did you find your voice? Like what writer you were going to be?
I don't think I found it yet. I'm still tinkering and trying to temper it in different ways. I think it depends on the story. In as much as I have a voice, I read somewhere recently because I run a workshop at the library where I work, writer's workshop, and somebody asked, if I could talk a little bit about that, and I said I can try. And the closest thing sniffing around, I can't remember the article, honestly, but someone said that your voice is as much about what you're talking about as how you're saying it, the subjects that drive you. And again, I don't know what drives the particular themes that fuel my work, but my voice is a mixture of reading people that I have a visceral reaction to, not things that I think are necessarily good or bad stories or that sell a lot or that are well known, but writing that makes me reread it the same way people listen to a piece of music over and over again. That's what I gravitate to. And these are all over the map. From the bare boned, Andrew Vax to again, Seth Morgan, just the acrobatic, pyrotechnic Seth Morgan was probably one of the early influences, and then everything in between. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, Andrew Vox, another guy I did an interview with. I met him back in the '90s,
Rest his soul.
and that was very intimidating interview. But
No doubt.
I was and photographer came in, and it was kind of a scary situation. He kind of let me off at the hook because I was being a little, you know how I was, I'm being a little cavalier, and he was very against child molestation. He was
Yeah, well, he's a lawyer who basically fought for children his entire
he
career.
wasn't, he was, I was still kind of making jokes about prostitution because I was hanging around Volman a lot. Okay,
Right.
so when I got to New York, I was hanging around with Jonathan Lethem and Brett Easton Ellis, and they were like friendly comrades for a couple years, and and then I suddenly realized in '97 that writers make as much money from movie options than they do from their book sales and stuff.
Oh yeah.
So what's been, that kind of didn't hit me till like '97 or '98, maybe is that's where, like it seems like, okay, well, there's these writers that are academics and they're professors and they make their money from there. There's people that teach writing that I've interviewed, and then there's people that every book gets options and stuff. So what's been your experience with movie options and income?
That's pretty much it, yeah, I mean, unless you're at the level of, Stephen King or Judith Krantz or somebody like that, where you can actually make a lavish living, just with book sales. Most writers are going to make more money on the film options. I think James Ellroy called it the great cosmic welfare check. Just keep them coming, with the options, they're not buying the rights, they're paying for the privilege of having first crack at buying the rights. So they're paying you to keep it off the market. And this is so because they need 18 months to get a screenplay, to get a director, get the whole package together to appease the studio. And so those little chunks that have come through over the years are the things that have really sustained me. Unfortunately, my first, publisher was just fucked up, and they took half of that, which most don't.
That's too much, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, that's been my experience. And so, Mother Howl, there's no option for it yet. Based on the reviews, I'm not sure if there's going to be one, but I can dream.
Yeah, I mean, I think that thing all started with Robert Evans when he optioned Love Story and the Godfather books, and they were bestsellers, and then they were big movies, and then so that's been like about 50 years of writers getting like checks for their works and stuff. Okay, so Mother Howl started out as a short story. Can you talk about that development?
Yeah, it was just a random brain fart. I was writing Dermaphoria, and it was between drafts, and I just had this. I'm not very prolific, so I don't kick out a lot of short stories, and every now and then one sparks in my head, and I'll get it down. And it started out as a short story called The Fade. I didn't bother submitting it anywhere. Like I said, I'm not very prolific, and what little I do write in terms of short fiction, it would just take a decade for anything to really land anywhere. To this day, even with 3 books under my belt, whenever I read the marketplace and they say, read the magazine to get an idea of what they're looking for, I still have no bloody clue. Unless it's a deep genre niche magazine, the general broad literary ones, Granta and such, I glean nothing. So I don't even bother. I put it on my website and that was that. But over time, when I was ready to write a new book, I was just it was the form of a letter. It began with Dear Lyle. And I just thought, okay, who is Lyle? And that's where it came from. And that the letter that's in the novel is a much longer version of the original short story. It's much expanded from that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those magazines like Paris Review and Granta and Conjunctions and
Yeah,
I mean, they're all who those people. I met a lot of them. I went to parties at George Plimpton's house and stuff, and you hang out, and I was there in New York when Open City started, and I used to hang around Thomas Beller and Daniel Pinchbeck and all those guys, and it was like, yeah, I mean, you know, just sending stories out is, I mean, it's like a crapshoot. I mean, I've published a few times that way, but if I knew somebody who started a magazine, or I started my own magazine, you know, it's like publish me and I'll publish you kind of thing. That's what happened.
Yeah. I would know, like I said, I have very little to do that. I think I've published maybe 5 or 6 short stories in print over the course of my career. So
Yeah, and yeah, I mean that, and yeah, and a lot of that stuff's done by agents and stuff, and book publishers are placing things around. So what about some of these characters? I mean, Icarus, 20 Long, where did they come from? I mean, this book, it's not really specific like where it takes place, but it kind of seems like a combination of LA and San Francisco. Am I right?
yeah, that's a loose way. That's pretty much what I had in mind. I was playing very loose with the setting. Yeah, so yeah, Lyle just sort of emerged organically over time. 20 Long, I volunteered at the AIDS Foundation Needle Exchange when I was up in the Bay Area, and we had basically we were giving getting fresh needles out there for exchangers to, kind of keep them from being thrown in parks and, on grass and beaches, and keep people from swapping out and spreading, transmitting diseases and such. But we had basically, there's 3 types: long, shorts, and micros. It was a combination of needle length and barrel size. And if you didn't have any to exchange, you could get up to 20 just for the asking. So we would have people coming in all morning. I'd hear over and over again, I'm looking for 20 Long. Can I get 20 Long? And it took me a while for that to click as the name. I needed some kind of underground street surgeon, and that name clicked, was as being perfect for that. Icarus, I've said it in other places. I can tell you everything about why he is the way he is. I could not, with a gun to my head, tell you where he came from, where the idea came from, why he dropped into my brain. But there he is.
But some of these people are kind of based on kind of like people you saw in the street, or homeless people, or kind of like these kind of mad geniuses that just kind of are screaming at the top of their lungs or something.
Yeah, I mean, the only character that was really, I really kind of plucked out of my surroundings was Roger, the violin player. I don't know if he's still up there or not, but there was one guy down at the Civic Center BART station that had a violin that I think he fished out of a dumpster. You may have seen him.
Yeah.
You remember him. That's he was always looking at music. I saw him one time actually writing stuff on a sheet of cardboard, but when he played, it was just manic. So that's the only thing I really got from that. Yeah, Icarus was, I never had anything visually in mind other than I wanted him to be large and intimidating. I didn't want him to be the beatific, gentle angel that is usually the case. So I wanted to be kind of a bull in a china shop.
Well, what do you think about some of these workshops or poetry readings? I just think, I mean, why I'm so glad that we have a book like Mother Howl is because, I mean, it was like, to me, like the 90s was a great period because I got to interview a lot and read a lot of these books. And David Foster Wallace, Jonathan Franzen wrote the corrections in 2001. And then, I mean, there was hardly anything after that. Like, I wasn't really that much of a big fan of Dave Eggers, and Roberto Bolaño was okay. And then it just seemed like some of the books that come out, I mean, there'll occasionally be like 1 or 2 interesting books. And here's one of them right here this year. Definitely.
Thank you.
On my top list, but I mean, it seemed like in the 80s, like, you could have like people like Gordon Lish going around teaching classes, and it sort of worked because you could hone, because there was I mean, there was like what was the guy, the minimalist, the short stories guy,
Raymond Carver.
Yeah, there was people like Raymond Carver and Amy Hempel that. And there was like a Gordon Lish minimalist movement kind of happening. And that was kind of like a post Hemingway kind of thing kind of going on. And then there was just all these wild people like Burroughs and Kathy Acker around. And, and I went to some poetry readings recently. They just seem not very literary, just sort of more about therapy and, I don't know, just I'm not really impressed. It just seems like the people don't read books. They usually read off their phones.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that, I mean, I can't speak for workshops in general. I mean, I can say that, here in Santa Barbara, there's a very thriving poetry community. And we host a semi-annual event at the library, and people take it really seriously. I mean, as far as workshops go, um, it's tricky because I think once every couple of years there's that wave of pro and con MFA debates that spark up online, and I got no skin on that dog, or whatever the saying is. I've got I think if you have the luxury of being in a place that's going to let you knuckle down for 2 years without distraction and hone your craft, do it by all means. But I think there's a point where, Vanessa Vaselka said, you really need that unfaltering faith in your own instincts. You've heard the term workshop to death, I think, where people try to take every piece of criticism and make something that appeases all of those points, and you end up with something that is just hammered flat and leaves no lingering impression. So I think once the criticism starts to overlap, look at that core and consider it, but otherwise trust your own instincts.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, that just sounds like some movie script written by 20 people, like by committee. It doesn't really work for me. I don't know. But yeah, what else? Okay, so so poetry. Yeah, and yeah, poetry readings. I mean, I just think like poetry, maybe it's past its time, like painting, I mean,
I don't know. Like I said, it's alive here. It's just never been my genre. I think I love the saying, and maybe I'm misquoting it, but every novelist is a failed short story writer, and every short story writer is a failed poet. And I think the people that can do economy of language like that to me, it's staggering. To me, it's like reading a foreign language for the most part. I really struggle with it.
I mean, I just think the opposite. I think like, to me, like painting, I mean, who can name, like, can you name like 5 great painters like in the last 20 years? I don't.
Contemporary paint, yeah. I don't follow art, so
Yeah,
yeah.
well, I think it's the same thing for poetry. I don't think there's 10 great poets like that publish their best books like this in the past 5 years.
Yeah, that may, in terms of numbers, you're probably correct. But I can tell you one thing that really recharged my faith in that. When I started working at libraries about, I don't know, 8 years ago, seeing the amount of poetry that gets cycled through there, people checking this stuff out,
Yeah,
I mean, it is, people still do absorb that and appreciate it. It's remarkable to see.
people are writing it, but I don't think people are reading it. That's what I'm saying.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They're reading it. I mean, we're seeing, Mary Oliver, especially after she died, her books were circulating like mad, but she's not the only one. We see them come through. I mean, I may be a little, naively optimistic here, but working in libraries has done wonders for my cynicism.
What about that sensitive skin reading? I think I was published in sensitive. Was that in New York or was that in here?
Oh, that was in San Francisco. That's where I read with Darius James. And
Oh, okay, yeah.
if you ever get the chance to see Darius James read, do it. It is like watching, I don't know, an Olympic event. He is staggering. I mean, it's like watching James Brown do poetry. All the sweat, and I mean, it's all there. It's fantastic. He was a blast to meet.
Well, let me ask you one more final question. Okay, so the writers, I did a thing about Gilbert Sorrentino. He was born in 29, and he wrote his whole life on typewriters.
Yeah.
And never really went over to the computer. I myself wrote on typewriters, switched over to computers, wrote my book, Five Fingers Make a Fist. I wrote it mostly in little notebooks and then took it over to computers. I wrote this new book I'm working on recently. I wrote it directly on the computer. I wanted it to be a little bit different. I mean, how do you write? Or do you write it out longhand first, or?
It's all longhand. Yeah. Everything ends up with a stack of at least 5 or 6, big A4 notebooks and a whole bunch of other loose papers. So yeah, it helps. I just like the way my brain approaches things when I'm working longhand. Eventually, the tedious part is transcribing, and I do the first round of edits, on a hard copy longhand as well. It's not until I start getting into really, watchmaker tinkering level edits that I go pure digital, but most of it's done longhand prior to that.
Okay, well, we're kind of running out of time here, so here's the book. It's excellent.
Thank you, Laura. Ouch.
We can people can find it on craigclevenger.com and Amazon and bookstores near you. You just did a reading at Book Soup, so maybe go there.
Yeah, it might still be there. I know Artifact down in Encinitas has a goodly chunk of them. And then there's Timber in Ventura. I haven't done much touring, so I've just been, signing stock where I can at indie bookstores.
What's next? Are you more readings, more writing?
Right now, I'm just trying to wrap up this bloody book that's been haunting me for a few years now. I feel like I've got my mojo back, so I'm going to try to see if I can lock this thing down by the end of the year.
Okay, well, thanks for talking to me. Check out the website. We'll have links in the description here, and this will be going out today. And thanks for talking to me again. Good to